A life in chains. Bruno had never known what it felt like to be free. From the moment he was strong enough to stand on his shaky legs, he had been tethered to a thick iron chain inside a dimly lit barn. The cold metal looped tightly around his neck, restricting his movement to only a few short steps forward and back. No matter how much he pulled, no matter how hard he strained against it, the chain never gave way. The barn itself was nothing more than a prison, a long, narrow structure with wooden beams that groaned against the wind. Rows of other bulls stood in similar confinement, their once powerful bodies dulled by the same cruel reality. Some had given up entirely, their heads hanging low, their eyes void of hope. Bruno was still young, just under 2 years old, but he was beginning to feel the same exhaustion creeping into his bones. The world beyond his stall was a mystery. His entire life had been spent in this damp enclosure, where the only sounds were the clinking of chains, the occasional low grunts of other bulls, and the distant murmur of farmhands talking outside. He had never seen an open field, never felt the soft touch of grass beneath his hooves. Instead, his days blurred together in a monotonous cycle. Wake up, eat the stale hay thrown carelessly at his feet, stand in place for hours, and then drift into restless sleep on the cold concrete floor. But what hurt most wasn't the physical pain. It was the loneliness. Bruno longed for companionship, for someone to acknowledge his existence beyond a mere source of profit. The other bulls rarely interacted with him, their spirits too broken to care. The farmhands who passed by barely spared him a glance. He was nothing more than a tool to them, an animal meant to grow large, to be used, and eventually discarded. Some nights, when the barn was at its quietest, Bruno would stare out through the small, dirty window above his stall. Through the grime and cobwebs, he could see the faint glow of the moon. It was the only glimpse of the outside world he had ever known. And even though he had never set foot beyond these walls, something deep within him told him there was more to life than this. Then, one evening, something changed. Bruno's ears perked up at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps approaching the barn. These weren't the heavy, indifferent steps of the usual farmhands. These were lighter, slower, and somehow different. The barn door creaked open, and a rush of cool night air filtered inside. Bruno lifted his head as a figure stepped forward, a man with kind eyes and a soft expression. The man crouched down in front of Bruno's stall, his gaze filled with something Bruno had never seen before: compassion. "Hey there, big guy," the man said gently, his voice a stark contrast to the rough, commanding shouts Bruno was used to hearing. Bruno stared at him, unsure of how to react. Humans never spoke to him this way. They never looked at him like this. The man extended his hand, palm open, inviting trust rather than forcing it. Bruno hesitated, his large nostrils flaring as he inhaled the stranger's scent. He smelled different, not of cold steel or the sour stench of sweat, but of something warm, something safe. For a long moment, Bruno didn't move. Then, slowly, cautiously, he leaned forward and nudged the man's hand with his nose. A smile broke across the man's face. "You're a gentle one, aren't you?" Bruno didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was kind, reassuring. The man, his name was Marcus, ran his fingers gently across Bruno's forehead, scratching behind his ears the way a mother cow might have done when Bruno was still a calf. It sent a shiver down Bruno's spine, but not from fear. It felt nice. For the first time in his life, a human was touching him not with indifference or cruelty, but with care. Marcus exhaled, his expression darkening as he took in the sight of the thick chain wrapped around Bruno's neck. His fingers traced the cold metal, his jaw tightening. "I'm so sorry," Marcus whispered. Bruno tilted his head slightly. He didn't understand why this man looked sad, but something told him that, for the first time, someone saw him not as an object, but as a living being. A sudden noise broke the moment. The distant sound of another farmhand's voice rang through the night. Marcus straightened and glanced toward the entrance. He wasn't supposed to be here. With one last gentle touch to Bruno's muzzle, Marcus stepped back. But before he turned to leave, he whispered two final words. "I'll be back." Bruno watched as the man disappeared into the shadows. For the first time in his life, he felt something stir inside him, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Hope. And though he didn't yet understand what was coming, one thing was certain. His life was about to change forever. The promise of freedom. The following week, Bruno stood at the same spot in his stall, staring out at the same grimy window. The warm glow of the sun, filtering through the dust and shadows, cast fleeting patterns on the barn floor. His mind was restless, filled with thoughts of the stranger. Marcus. Every evening, when the shadows grew long and the cool night air swept through the barn, Bruno would wait. His massive body would twitch with anticipation, his senses heightened, as if he could somehow feel the presence of the man who had spoken so kindly to him. But the days passed, and Marcus did not return. The barn remained unchanged, the same old routine of feeding and waiting, feeding and waiting. Yet in the back of Bruno's mind, a spark had been lit, a quiet, unwavering belief that the man's words meant something. "I'll be back." It was a promise, something that Bruno had never experienced before. His life had always been dictated by chains, walls, and the passing indifference of time. Now the thought of freedom gnawed at him relentlessly. The feeling of grass beneath his hooves, the sensation of running through open fields. He could almost taste it. But the days went by, and the familiar weight of his chain continued to hold him back. Each day, as the sunlight dimmed and the stars began to twinkle outside, Bruno would let out a long, low bellow, a sound that echoed through the barn, a call for something more. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, Marcus returned. It was late, the moon hanging high in the sky, casting silver light through the cracks in the barn. Bruno's heart raced when he heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside. He lifted his head, his breath coming in shallow bursts, and waited. The door creaked open, and Marcus stepped inside, his face illuminated by the dim glow of a lantern he held in his hand. Bruno's eyes locked onto him immediately. This time, the stranger wasn't alone. Behind Marcus, a large trailer sat idling in the yard, its lights glowing faintly in the darkness. Marcus moved closer, his gaze softening as he looked at Bruno. He was carrying something, a set of wire cutters. Bruno's chest tightened with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, but filled with a tenderness that struck deep within Bruno's heart. The bull's muscles tensed as if preparing to bolt, but Marcus was there, gently talking to him, coaxing him forward. "I'm here to set you free," Marcus continued. "This is the end of the chains. No more of this life for you, Bruno. I promise." The words resonated deeply within Bruno, but it wasn't until he felt the cold steel of the cutters sliding through the chain, severing it with a clean snip, that the reality hit him. The weight he had known all his life was suddenly gone. Bruno stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do. The chain that had bound him to his tiny stall for so long now lay in a heap at his feet, a useless mass of metal. His neck felt light, the absence of the constant restriction, a surreal sensation. But then something unexpected happened. Bruno took a step forward, then another. The barn door was wide open now, and the cool night air rushed in, fresh and full of unfamiliar scents. The distant sounds of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind reached Bruno's ears, and his eyes widened as the vast world outside came into focus. This was it, the moment of freedom. At first, Bruno was cautious. He shuffled forward, his massive hooves making soft thuds on the floor, testing the ground beneath him. His body, built for strength and endurance, had never been allowed to move freely. He stumbled a few times, his legs not used to the space. But then, like a switch had been flipped, the instinct to run kicked in. Bruno's large body surged forward, the wind rushing past him, and for the first time, he was truly free. He ran out of the barn, into the open field that stretched out before him like a boundless ocean. The grass beneath his hooves felt strange, but exhilarating. He kicked up his heels, his powerful legs propelling him across the land with a grace that was almost magical. The freedom was intoxicating. Bruno's heart pounded in his chest, and the joy that surged through him was indescribable. He did a little hop, a dance of sorts, his hooves striking the earth in rhythm with his newfound happiness. For a few moments, Bruno forgot where he was. He was lost in the sheer ecstasy of movement, the feeling of finally being alive. Marcus stood in the doorway of the barn, watching with a warm smile on his face as Bruno bounded through the field. The bull's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. "I knew you'd love it out here," Marcus whispered to himself. As Bruno slowed down and circled back to Marcus, he stopped a few feet away, breathing heavily but contentedly. His large eyes locked onto the man who had set him free, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Marcus approached slowly, his hand extended once again. This time, Bruno didn't hesitate. He walked toward the man and nuzzled his palm, his massive head lowering to make contact. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Bruno's nuzzle was soft, almost as if he was thanking Marcus in return. And though the night was dark and quiet, the world around them seemed to hum with the promise of something new, something brighter. The life that Bruno had known, the life of confinement and pain, was over. As the hours passed, Bruno explored the field more, his movements becoming smoother, more fluid. He rubbed his face in the soft straw that covered the ground, rolled in the grass, and even tested the waters of a small pond nearby. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged to the world. Marcus stood by, watching, a contented smile on his face. His heart swelled with joy as he watched Bruno take his first steps into the world he had always been denied. But there was more to be done. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Tomorrow, they would take the next step, toward a new home, a sanctuary for animals like Bruno, where he could live the rest of his life in peace, free from the chains of his past. For now, though, the only thing that mattered was the moment. The pure, untainted joy that Bruno felt as he galloped across the open fields, his body finally unshackled, his spirit soaring high. And for the first time in his life, Bruno felt like he had truly found home. The journey to a new home. The dawn came softly, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold as the first rays of sunlight kissed the horizon. Bruno stood at the edge of the field, his large, muscular frame silhouetted against the morning mist. His nostrils flared as he inhaled deeply, taking in the crisp, dew-kissed air. This was the first sunrise he had ever truly witnessed, unchained, unshackled, free. For a moment, he simply stood there, unmoving, as if savoring every second. The cold metal collar that had once pressed against his thick neck was gone. His skin no longer felt the constant tug of chains. He was his own master now, and the realization of it still felt unreal. Marcus stood nearby, leaning against the wooden fence that marked the edge of the property. His arms were crossed over his chest, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face as he watched Bruno explore his newfound freedom. He had spent years rescuing animals from cruelty, but something about this bull felt different. Maybe it was the way Bruno had responded to kindness, or the way he had danced in the moonlight the night before. But their journey together was far from over. Marcus sighed, glancing at the large animal trailer parked a few yards away. They had only completed the first step, freeing Bruno from his chains. The next part would be even more challenging, convincing him to step inside the trailer and embark on a long journey to a sanctuary where he could live out the rest of his life in peace. Bruno, unaware of what lay ahead, continued his slow walk through the damp grass, occasionally stopping to nuzzle the ground with his nose. The soft earth felt strange beneath his hooves, nothing like the hard concrete of the barn where he had spent his entire life. "Bruno," Marcus called gently. The bull's ears twitched, and he turned his massive head toward the sound of his name. His dark eyes met Marcus's, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. "It's time to go," Marcus said, stepping forward slowly, his hand outstretched in a familiar gesture of trust. Bruno took a step toward him, then another. He was beginning to understand that Marcus meant no harm. But as Marcus led him toward the trailer, a new kind of hesitation crept into Bruno's body. The trailer was large, dark, unfamiliar. Its metal walls gleamed under the morning sun, and the faint scent of other animals, horses, cows, even dogs, clung to its interior. Bruno stopped just short of the ramp leading up into the trailer. His hooves dug into the ground. His breathing became heavy, and his muscles tensed. Marcus could see the fear in his eyes. This bull, who had just begun to taste freedom, was now faced with another confinement. "It's okay," Marcus murmured, stepping beside him. "I know it's scary, but I promise you, Bruno, this is the last time you'll ever have to do this. No more chains, no more tiny stalls. Just a home. A real one." Bruno snorted softly, shifting his weight from one leg to another. He didn't trust cages. He didn't trust walls. Marcus sighed, realizing that brute force wouldn't work. He needed another approach. Stepping back, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an apple, bright red, freshly picked that morning. The scent wafted through the air, sweet and tempting. He held it out in front of Bruno's nose, letting the bull get a good whiff. Bruno's nostrils flared, and his tongue flicked out, tasting the air. "That's right, big guy, it's for you," Marcus said, his voice coaxing. Slowly, cautiously, Bruno stepped forward. One hoof landed on the wooden ramp. It creaked under his weight, but he didn't retreat. Encouraged, Marcus took another step back, leading Bruno further inside. Another hoof landed on the ramp, then another. A few moments later, Bruno was inside the trailer. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He gently patted Bruno's shoulder and set the apple down in front of him. "Good boy." Bruno took a slow bite, crunching through the sweet fruit, his body relaxing slightly. As Marcus secured the trailer door, he whispered, "This is the last journey you'll ever have to take like this. I promise." The road to Sanctuary. The drive was long, stretching across miles of open countryside. Marcus glanced in his rearview mirror every so often, watching as Bruno shifted inside the trailer. The bull didn't panic. He didn't thrash. Instead, he simply lay down, his massive body adjusting to the rhythm of the road. The sanctuary was nearly 100 miles away, tucked away in the rolling hills, surrounded by sprawling fields and lush meadows, a place where animals that had been neglected, abused, or abandoned could live without fear. Bruno had no idea what waited for him there. As the truck rumbled down the highway, Marcus thought about the first time he had heard about the sanctuary. It was a haven, a place where animals could experience love, care, and most importantly, freedom. No more chains, no more cold barns, no more neglect. Bruno would finally be somewhere he belonged. After hours of driving, the road curved into a long, winding path lined with tall trees. Marcus could see the sanctuary gates up ahead, wide and welcoming. As he slowed the truck, the gates opened, revealing a paradise beyond them. Fields stretched out as far as the eye could see, dotted with animals, cows, horses, goats, and even a few deer that had been rescued from poachers. A massive pond sparkled under the sunlight, and a large barn stood in the distance, its doors wide open, inviting and warm. This was it, Bruno's new home. Marcus parked the truck near the barn and hopped out, stretching his legs before making his way to the back of the trailer. He unlatched the door and slowly lowered the ramp. Inside, Bruno lifted his head, blinking against the sudden flood of sunlight. He hesitated, his large body shifting uncertainly. Marcus didn't rush him. He stepped back and let Bruno take his time. The bull sniffed the air, his ears twitching as he took in the unfamiliar sounds of other animals. He could hear the distant call of birds, the soft rustling of leaves, and even the gentle mooing of cows somewhere nearby. With slow, deliberate steps, Bruno descended the ramp. His hooves touched the soft grass, and he froze. He looked around, his massive chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. This place was nothing like where he had come from. There were no walls, no chains, no cages. For the first time, Bruno was standing on open land with nothing to hold him back. Marcus watched with quiet satisfaction as the bull took his first tentative steps forward. The other animals nearby lifted their heads, some trotting over curiously. A few cows approached, sniffing at Bruno in greeting. And then something magical happened. Bruno let out a deep, rumbling sound, a sound not of fear or hesitation, but of joy. His muscles relaxed, his eyes softened, and then, just as he had done the night before, he danced. He kicked up his hooves, spun in a clumsy but joyful circle, and tossed his head back as if laughing. Marcus laughed too, his heart swelling with happiness. Bruno was home, and for the first time in his life, he was truly free, learning the meaning of freedom. The golden afternoon sun stretched across the sanctuary, bathing everything in a warm glow. Birds soared overhead, their wings carving lazy circles in the sky. The scent of fresh hay and damp earth filled the air. Bruno stood in the middle of the vast open pasture, his large, muscular frame relaxed, his deep brown eyes scanning the land that was now his home. He had been at the sanctuary for only a few days, but already something inside him was changing. For the first time in his life, he could breathe without fear. No chains dug into his skin. No cold concrete floors trapped him. No hollow, empty barn echoed with the silence of suffering. He was free. But what did freedom truly mean? New faces, new life. Bruno's first few nights at the sanctuary were strange. His stall was nothing like the cold, cramped space he had known before. It was open, airy, and filled with fresh straw. He wasn't forced inside it either. If he wanted, he could step outside at any time. Yet the vastness of it all was almost overwhelming. On the second night, he hesitated at the threshold of his stall, peering out into the moonlit fields. The other animals, cows, horses, even a few rescued donkeys, moved freely across the pasture, grazing under the soft glow of the stars. Bruno's instincts told him to stay inside. The barn, though unfamiliar, still resembled the only world he had ever known. But another part of him, the part that had twirled and danced under the night sky just days before, longed to step out. So he did. His hooves pressed into the soft earth as he took slow, cautious steps forward. The cool night breeze ruffled his fur, and the whisper of leaves in the distance filled the silence. He was no longer surrounded by lifeless walls, but by the hum of nature, the rustle of creatures unseen. A gentle nudge startled him. Bruno turned his head to see an older cow standing beside him, a speckled, gray and white female with deep, kind eyes. She regarded him for a moment before leaning in and nudging him again, as if urging him to move forward. It was an invitation. Bruno took another step, then another. And for the first time, he walked into the night without fear. Challenges of a free life. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the pasture with a bucket of fresh feed and a warm smile. "Well, look who's finally getting used to things," he chuckled as he watched Bruno standing in the open field, surrounded by a few of the other cows. Bruno had expected Marcus to call him over, to demand something from him the way his old owners had, but Marcus didn't shout, didn't order. He simply set the bucket down and waited. Bruno hesitated. Something deep inside him still whispered caution. For so long, humans had only meant cruelty. Chains, whips, heavy hands that took and never gave. But Marcus had given him something no one else ever had. Patience. Trust. Bruno took a slow step forward, eyeing the bucket cautiously. He expected Marcus to reach out, to force him to eat from his hand. Instead, Marcus simply nodded and stayed back. Bruno sniffed the food, then took a bite. It was different from the dried, tasteless slop he had been given before. This was fresh, nourishing. For the first time, eating was not an act of survival. It was an act of enjoyment. Over the next few days, Bruno started to explore more of the sanctuary. He learned the routines of the other animals. He watched as horses galloped freely across the meadows, their manes flowing like liquid gold under the sun. He saw young calves playing by the pond, splashing in the water without a care in the world. And yet Bruno still carried the weight of his past. One afternoon, while wandering the far edge of the sanctuary, he spotted something that made his heart pound. A rope. It lay abandoned in the grass, coiled loosely, its frayed ends fluttering in the wind. Bruno froze. His breathing grew ragged. His muscles tensed, his body trembling. The sight of it dragged him back to his old life. The rough hands that had tied him down, the unbearable weight of chains, the way his skin had bled beneath the strain. His vision blurred as fear clawed at him. His legs felt weak. Then suddenly, a warm breath tickled his ear. He turned to see the same speckled cow who had nudged him that first night. She stood beside him, her presence steady, grounding. Bruno took a shaky breath. The rope was not in his captor's hands. It was not tied around his neck. It was just a piece of rope lying in the grass, and it had no power over him anymore. With a deep, slow exhale, Bruno stepped forward, away from the past, toward the future, finding his place. As the days turned into weeks, Bruno began to understand what freedom truly meant. It was in the wind that ruffled his fur. It was in the open fields that stretched endlessly before him. It was in the quiet companionship of the other animals, in the gentle way Marcus spoke to him, in the way no one forced him to do anything. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Bruno did something he had never done before. He ran. Not out of fear. Not because he was being chased or punished. He ran simply because he could. His hooves pounded against the earth, his powerful legs carrying him across the open field. The wind roared past his ears, filling his lungs with the scent of grass and wildflowers. His heart thundered in his chest, but it wasn't from panic, it was from exhilaration. And then, in a burst of pure joy, he leaped. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't planned. But it was free. Somewhere in the distance, Marcus stood watching. He smiled. Bruno had finally found his place in the world, and he had chosen to embrace it. The ghosts of the past and the strength to overcome. The sanctuary had become Bruno's home. His days were filled with the scent of fresh grass, the gentle hum of insects in the air, and the warmth of the sun stretching across his back. He had found companionship among the other animals, especially the speckled cow, whom the caretakers called Rosa. Yet, even in this newfound paradise, shadows from his past still lingered. Nightmares of the past. One evening, the sky painted itself in shades of deep orange and violet, as the sun set behind the rolling hills. The other animals slowly wandered back to their resting spots, their bellies full, their bodies relaxed. Bruno, too, found his way to the barn, though he no longer feared confinement. He had the choice to stay outside or step into the warmth of the straw-covered stall, and tonight he chose the latter. But sleep did not come easy. His mind drifted into the past, the cold metal chains around his neck, the damp, lifeless walls of his enclosure, the echoing voices of men shouting. In his dream, he was back there again, struggling against his restraints, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then something jerked at his neck. Bruno let out a sharp bellow, kicking his legs violently. He heard the rattle of chains, the sound of laughter that haunted him for years. No, not again. He thrashed in his stall, sending straw flying. His breathing was ragged, his body drenched in sweat. He needed to escape. Bruno. A familiar voice broke through the darkness. His wild eyes darted around, searching for the source. There stood Marcus, his caretaker, his voice calm yet firm. He wasn't shouting in anger. He wasn't wielding a rope or a stick. He was just standing there, his hands open, his expression filled with concern. "Bruno, it's okay," Marcus said softly. "You're safe." The words settled over him like a warm blanket. Bruno took deep, heavy breaths, his hooves still trembling. His stall was not a prison. The ropes and chains weren't real. It was just a dream. A dream, but one that still held power over him. Marcus stepped forward and knelt beside him, his presence grounding. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, big guy," he murmured, reaching out to stroke Bruno's head. "Nobody's ever going to hurt you again." Bruno leaned into the touch. The ghosts of his past still clung to him, but at that moment he realized something important. He was not alone in this fight. A test of courage. Days passed, and Bruno continued to grow stronger, more confident in his freedom. He no longer hesitated before stepping into the open fields. He no longer flinched at the sound of unfamiliar voices. But true healing comes with challenges. One morning, Marcus arrived at the sanctuary with something new. A wooden training post, wrapped in soft rope, positioned near the center of the pasture. Bruno eyed it warily. "It's okay," Marcus said, his tone gentle as always. "It's just a post. Something to help you get past your fears." Bruno didn't move. He knew what that thing was. It was the same kind of post he had been tied to for most of his life. The chains may not have been there, but the memory of them still was. The other animals watched from a distance. Rosa, his quiet companion, took a few steps toward him, nudging his side as if to say, "You can do this." Bruno swallowed his fear and moved forward, slowly, cautiously. With every step, his heartbeat pounded louder, his breaths grew heavier. Then he reached the post. Marcus stood beside it, not forcing Bruno to do anything, not trying to tie anything around his neck, just waiting. Bruno hesitated. Then, after a long moment, he did something unexpected. He lowered his head and rubbed his face against the wooden surface. It was rough, solid, but it did not hurt him. It did not hold him captive. The post was just a post. The past was just a memory, and memories had no power over him anymore. Embracing the present, the transformation was slow, but day by day, Bruno embraced the life he was meant to have. One morning, a group of visitors arrived at the sanctuary, families with children, animal lovers eager to see the rescued animals. Some of the cows shied away, preferring to watch from a distance. But not Bruno. With quiet confidence, he approached the fence where a young boy stood, staring up at him with wide eyes. "Wow," the child breathed. "He's huge." Bruno snorted softly. The boy hesitated, looking up at Marcus for permission. "Go ahead," Marcus encouraged. "Just hold out your hand and let him come to you." The boy stretched out his small fingers, trembling slightly. Bruno studied him for a moment, then slowly leaned forward, pressing his broad nose against the tiny palm. The boy gasped, then giggled. "He's so soft." Bruno let out a contented huff, nuzzling the boy's hand. For the first time, a human's touch did not bring fear or pain. It brought warmth, connection, understanding. A deep realization settled within him. He was no longer the chained bull in a dark enclosure. He was no longer a prisoner of his past. He was Bruno, strong, free, and unbreakable. A new dawn. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Bruno stood at the highest point of the sanctuary's pasture. The wind ruffled his fur. The land stretched before him, endless and open. Rosa stood beside him, silent as ever. Bruno glanced at her, then lifted his head to the sky. And with all the strength in his body, he let out a deep, triumphant bellow. It echoed across the fields, over the hills, through the trees. It was not a cry of pain. It was a declaration of freedom. And for the first time in his life, Bruno truly believed it.